Hello everyone, my name is Lowko and welcome back to some more StarCraft 2. Now with the release of every expansion, so Heart of the Swarm as well as Legacy of the Void, we didn't just see the addition of campaign as well as a bunch of other game modes, we also saw some massive changes to the multiplayer version of the game. Now what I want to be talking about is a blog post that got posted yesterday by David Kim, the balance designer for StarCraft 2, and they are planning on making some massive changes to Legacy of the Void as it is right now. And I'm not gonna lie, Legacy of the Void is definitely the best version of multiplayer we've ever seen, but apparently they think that there are a couple of things that, need changing up, and I actually do agree with them. So today I want to be reading through this blog post, I want to be giving you my opinion on the changes that they are announcing, and the changes they're willing to make, as well as give you a little bit more perspective than just, you can read out of this blog post. Now, I do want to let you know that this blog post is rather long. They are making a ton of changes, more so than they've ever done before, other than maybe with the release of an expansion. So I highly recommend you pause the video, grab yourself a drink, and put your thinking caps on, because this is gonna take a little bit of time, but bear with me. So here we go. I'm really excited for this, by the way, because this is honestly looking really cool, but let's get started. Alrighty, so StarCraft 2 Legacy of the Void brought with it the most significant overhaul to multiplayer we've seen in StarCraft 2's history. With this overhaul came many improvements, additional depth for those looking to master the game, and games now play out in incredibly unique ways, regardless of what happens in the first few minutes. Nevertheless, we believe we can make StarCraft 2 an even more enjoyable and competitive game experience, and we would like to explore a series of major changes to bring out these improvements. We intend to these changes to receive significantly more testing than the test maps we've done in the past. So basically whenever they've done, any kind of minor changes, they've done like a test map that you can download and play. So they want to be doing significantly more testing on this than they've done in the past, both because of the significance of the changes themselves and also due to the improvements we are making, which we will discuss in greater detail below. In order to provide ample time for a comprehensive period of testing, feedback and revision, we would like to release these changes at the conclusion of this year's tournament season in November. So basically at BlizzCon, the major event for Blizzard every single year, which is going to be apparently taking place in November. I didn't actually know that I don't actually know if they've already, lined up all the details for the tournament there, but the conclusion is going to be over in BlizzCon. And after that, they want to be releasing these changes. In the sections below, we've outlined the changes we are excited to explore in detail and provided the motivation or the motivating factors behind them. Alrighty, so let's get started to the massive changes they are planning on Terran. So for Terran, our primary focus is on improving the viability of factory unit armies, popularly known as mech compositions. While the resource changes in Legacy of the Void have been working great overall, they did have a unique effect on the effectiveness of mech. Outside of specific maps, such as for example Dusk Towers, it has been challenging for players to go mech due to the difficulty in securing additional expansions. Because the resource changes have been having such positive effects outside of mech play, we wanted to make some changes to mech to improve it across the different types of StarCraft 2 maps. So here's the main issue with mech, for those of you unaware. In order to properly max out on an army with mechanical units, such as siege tanks, Thors, and all those kinds of armies, you need to have a lot of resources. But the issue is that in Legacy of the Void, a lot of your bases mine out roughly 10 minutes in the game. And before mech can really get started, you need to secure about 3 to 4 bases before you can properly start producing your army. But by the time you're getting your 4th base started and you can actually defend it, your main and your natural will have started mining out. So in almost every version of Terran in StarCraft 2 right now, you just sort of play a bio-based army, a Marine Marauder medevac-based army, just because that is actually affordable and you can quite easily expand it. Now, a map such as Dusk Towers had 3 bases that you could easily take, as well as a ramp leading up to the 3rd, and you could defend all of that relatively easily, and you could secure 3 bases really early on, and therefore actually get an army size that was enough to, also secure a 4th. Right now though, as far as the current state goes, because that map is not in the map pool anymore, basically mech is gone. And while many of you may not like mech, it definitely is an integral part of StarCraft 2, and I am very happy that they are addressing this. So let's get started at the very first unit apparently that they are interested in changing. The Cyclone. We are planning to explore a complete redesign of the Cyclone to make it a core unit with a powerful anti-armored attack against ground units. The unit will remain fragile for its cost, but will have a fast movement speed. This way, the Cyclone can combo well with Hellion early on, in order to defend additional bases or to keep the opponent contained while playing a more aggressive style. Alrighty, so the design changes. Anti-ground weapon heavily changed. Damage changed from 3+3 to armored, attacks every 0.7 seconds, range increased from 5 to 6, and the weapon upgrade amount changed from 2 to 1 to account for the new damage value. Changed the weapon name to the Tornado Blaster, very important apparently, and it has no longer an anti-air weapon. Movement speed decreased from 4.72 to 4.13. Lock-on now can target air units only. Range is unchanged and the ability now deals 160 damage over 14 seconds. Removed autocast for the lock-on ability and a whole bunch of other changes that I don't want to be boring you with. But basically what it comes down to is that you're going to be able to use the Cyclone as an early game unit to actually defend against all kinds of aggression. So what we're looking right here at the very top is a couple of Cyclones going up against a few Stalkers. And there's some massive changes to that because as you can see, in particular in the Terran versus Protos matchup, you would see maybe 1 or 2 Cyclones to deal with any kind of War Prison play and, you know, some shenanigans as well. But all in all, the Cyclone was never a core unit to the Terran and more of like a stepping stone to actually defend against all kinds of all-ins, at which point you would transition toward better mech units as well. So all in all, I can't complain about this change. It's hard to say exactly how it will play out, in particular, you know, once we have a look at the other changes as well. But in general, this is definitely a good thing. Next up, the Siege Tank. Now, the Siege Tank is a much more common unit and something that many of you will be aware of, I suppose. The Siege Tank. The iconic unit is a critical part of the mech composition. After numerous discussions with players, a key understanding has surfaced. The added mobility granted by the medevac pickup in Legacy of the Void also brought about the loss of one of the Siege Tank's most enjoyable aspect, incredibly effective area control. Yet, constructing medevacs, a unit which heal only biological unit, is often not the right choice for mech players, and so these players are not able to take the full advantage of the Siege Tank's strengths. So in its current state in Legacy of the Void, you're able to pick up a sieged up tank with a medevac and therefore harass your opponent, but also push very aggressively, right? Because you can pick up all the siege tanks, boost forward with your medevacs, and then drop them down. Now, I would say, and I know that some of you may not agree with me, but in Terran versus Zerg and Terran versus Protoss, it's not that big of a deal. But the play where it really comes into very, very important decision making, I suppose, is Terran versus Terran. In Terran versus Terran, it just, you know, the matchup is based around Marines and Siege Tanks, right? And because you're making medevacs to heal up your Marines anyway, it's basically a prerequisite to go for the Siege Up tanks and push your Siege Tanks forward that way. And honestly, there's very little thinking and strategy involved. You can just sort of pick up all your stuff and drop in your opponent's base, or you can, you know, all of a sudden push their natural and catch them off guard, and it's just very hit or miss. And in general, for a lot of people, it ruined the Terran versus Terran matchup. I also never have been the biggest fan of it. I like harassment options, but I think Terran has plenty of those. So I'm glad to hear that they're making some changes. So here are the changes, right? So Sieged Up Siege Tank damage increased from 35 plus 15 to armored to 40 plus 30 to armored. Now, what exactly does this mean? Well, basically, if you're going to be attacking into a Sieged Up Terran player and say you're pushing with Roaches, your Roaches, which are going to be armored units, and we'll have a look at Ravagers in a little bit as well, but your Roaches are going to get absolutely shredded by the Siege Tanks. It's just the way the unit works right now. However, Siege Tanks can no longer be picked up by medevacs. So what this means is that you will be able to once again have some insane control with Siege Tanks, very similarly to how they work out in StarCraft Brood War, which in my opinion is a great change and exactly what I hope to see. So it's going to be a far more powerful unit in that regard, and as you can see the changes here as well. So one of the things to note here is that one of the changes they're making to Ravagers is that they're also going to be armored, and you know, since they do 40 plus 32 armored units, that means they're going to do a ridiculous amount of damage. Now, whether or not this is too much, I mean, I can imagine that if it takes like 2 shots to kill a Roach, it may be a little bit on the higher end, or 2 or 3 shots, whatever. This is obviously like the number they're naming off right here is just the initial one that they're going for. The fact of the matter is that this will most likely be a little bit too strong, at least from reading over it initially. But the actual idea behind it and the thought process, I think, is A-okay and something we are definitely, you know, looking for in StarCraft. So I'm a very big fan of that. Next up, we got the Liberator and the Thor. Since its addition to the game, the Liberator has seen much play. We hear and agree with the feedback, stating that they are currently too strong all round. So for those of you unfamiliar, they do bonus damage against light units and against air. So for example, if you're, going up against Mutalisk as a Terran player, you just sort of start making Liberators and you can counter both Mutalisk as well as the tech switch to Ultralisk, because they also have one of the most powerful anti-ground unit attacks, right? And it just basically makes it a very, very all-round unit. It has almost completely taken over the purpose of a Viking in all of the other situations as well. And while you will still see Vikings every now and then because of their cost and the way they play out, in general, it's a little too well-rounded, right? Therefore, we wanted to remove the plus light damage on their anti-air attacks so that they will still serve as the early game anti-ground harassment option as well as the late game zone control option, but they will require a greater commitment to be effective against large units of smaller air. To compensate for this change, we would like to focus on amplifying the anti-air capabilities of the Thor. So, as you may be aware, Thors right now see barely any play whatsoever, so just simply not very efficient for the cost. We'd like to explore increasing the splash radius on their splash attacks of the Javelin missiles, and we're experimenting with the changes to the Tempest and Brute Lord to make a Thor a more capable unit to counter those. So first and foremost, they're gonna be removing the plus light damage attack, which is great. Basically what that means is that right now, as you may be aware, Mutalisk are very difficult to pull off, as Mutas get absolutely shredded if you miss micro them from even a second. Since Mutalisk are going to be light biological units, all of a sudden Liberators will not be doing that bonus damage to them anymore, which is great. And then, you will be able to transition a little bit later into other units as well. And then obviously with the buff to the Thor, things should be looking good as well. So the anti-air splash from the Javelin missile, radius increased from 0.5 to 0.6. Now, it may not sound very significant, but once again, that does punish players that are mis-microing their Mutalisk. But if you are good at micro, say you're using the magic box trick, you will not be taking nearly as much damage. So it's all going to come down to the strength there. And the Thor's high impact payload mode, the anti-air weapon, the 250mm Punisher cannons apparently, will now be prioritized before the anti-ground weapon, the Thor's hammer. So what that means is that Thors are going to be a lot better at anti-air, and therefore you're going to probably be able to use them as well while transitioning towards a counter to, say, Brute Lords, which is a very logical change after, forcing your opponent to go for the Liberator play. So it's going to be, interesting. So here's the before and after. As you can see, we see 3 Liberators go up against, like 10 or so Mutas. The splash damage is ludicrous. It absolutely murders them. And while they still will do quite well, Mutalisk will at the very least come out on top. Now, you gotta keep in mind that in many air-to-air battles, it's very difficult to micro. As Liberators are rather fast, so it's much easier for the Mutalisk to clump up together. Whereas if you're going up against, say, for example, Thors, generally speaking, you can actually make it so that, I can make a video about that, I have done that in the past, but you can make it so that Mutalisk will spread out. So what that basically means is that Liberators are gonna be first and foremost less all-round, which is a great thing. Mutalisk are once again a legit option in the Zerg versus Terran matchup, which is awesome. And the other matchups aren't really going to be, they aren't really going to be affected. On top of that, I don't know if this buff to the Thor is enough. I don't think it is, to be completely honest with you. They may have to add additional range, for example, to, say, the Thor's anti-air attack. So right now, you will still not have a legit counter to, basically what happened in Legacy of the Void is that Brute Lords got additional range, and Thors can never really hit them, in particular once they got, a bunch of Brutelings, tickling at their feet. So I wouldn't be surprised if they would have to, say, like, increase the anti-air range of the Thor to make it an actual integral part of the Terran arsenal when you're going for mech. But all in all, once again, I think it may be buffed up a little bit, but all in all, the changes do seem to be very, very good and something that I am very much so looking forward to. I mean, I love playing Mutaling Bane. It's just that the ground-based armies are just much better, as it is currently in Legacy of the Void, just because one little miss micro and all your mutas are gone. So here's the splash damage radius as well. As you can see, the Thor will be able to do a little bit more damage to splash, or to, like, they will do a little bit more damage as well to mutas that are, spread out, but in general, it shouldn't be that efficient. As you can see right here, it will make a change in these small numbers, but honestly, this is mostly just a miss micro by a Zerg player, because who is going to be target firing, in that way? Like, everyone's always going to take out one of the Thors and then move over to the next, and it would still end up winning. But anyway, the thought process behind it is very, very good. Next up, we got the Banshee. The Banshees are units we'd like to bring into the spotlight. To do this, we'd like to first test having no requirement for the Banshee speed upgrade, and we know that Banshees may end up being too strong with this change, and if that happens, we can lower the amount of the speed to upgrade grants. Our goal is to give just the right amount of speed buff so that the Banshees are used more often than now and to make their relationship with their counters less one-sided. So they want to remove the fusion core requirement for the Hyperflight Rotors upgrade. The Hyperflight Rotors upgrade is an upgrade that will allow you to move much faster with the Banshee. This is actually, I believe, a change they proposed back in the day a couple of months ago, because the Banshee is right now, as well-rounded as the Liberator currently is, as like one-sided the Banshee is right now. What I mean with that is that you're only going to be making Banshees as harassment options in the early part of the game because they have no anti-air attack. So generally speaking, as soon as like one, Phoenix comes out into play, or one Mutalisk comes out into play, or one Corruptor comes out, any of those air units comes out to play, the Banshee is completely done for. Now, this may very well be a little bit too scary, and I want to say that it would still be an okay harassment option, but I would like to see Banshees to be a little bit more of an integral part. Their damage output right now is insane, and with the movement speed, they may be able to, be used a little bit more in a core army composition. But I'm not entirely sure if this will be truly, allowing them to be used more often. I mean, the fact of the matter is that even with a speed boost, you're still looking to, catch your opponent off guard, right? When you come in with your Cloak Banshee. So if you're going to have to first off research Cloak and then get the Hyperflight Rotors upgrade as well, you're not really going to be using it any more often in harassment options. And on top of that, it's not going to be any more common in core army compositions, right? So I don't know exactly if I like the Banshee upgrade all too much, but at the very least, I like to see it a little bit more often in the game, other than just an harassment unit, and I guess this will help a little bit. I may want to see some more buffs there. Next up, we got the Viking, and the Viking change is really cool. This is actually something I really, really want to talk about. We want to make the Viking's ability to transform a situationally useful thing, but we definitely don't want players to build Vikings for the ground modes when there are no air threats in the game. This change could help achieve that. So right now, the only point where you actually land your Vikings is if you accidentally press the hotkey, or if you like randomly manage to destroy all of the air damage or all of the air army that your opponent had, and you've practically won the game already. So in the late game of, in particular, like Terran versus Protos, you just sort of land your Vikings and you walk them to victory, right? You don't actually transform them back. What they're doing is giving them a +8 damage versus mechanical bonus. And what that in particular means is that they're going to be able to do a lot of damage to, for example, Stalkers. So obviously the Zerg versus Terran matchup won't really be affected by that. But it'd be cool to at the very least see the use of the Vikings come into play, and maybe use it to, say, snipe a War Prism and then use it for a very quick counterattack, or snipe a quick Phoenix opener and then also switch into the ground mode for the Vikings and actually make them part of the army that you're pushing against the Protos. And it's actually very, very cool. I like the idea a lot. It won't really change it might change Terran versus Terran somewhat, but since you're always going to be using the Vikings to zone anyway and get the vision and all that, in particular with the buffed up siege tanks, it's hard to say how how often you will be putting them on the ground in Terran versus Terran. But all in all, once again, I'm a fan. I like this a lot. I think, I always thought that Vikings were one of the most badass units in StarCraft, and right now, they're just basically an anti-air unit that gets a lot of overlap with the Liberator, and they don't really have their specific role anymore, other than like single target damage to air. So maybe if your opponent is going for like Carrier or Brute Lord or whatever, you would make them, but other than that, they're mostly like a sighting tool and to snipe your opponent's medevacs and all that. And with this change, I may actually really enjoy seeing them in core Terran compositions. In particular, say if you're opening up with like Cyclones and Hellions in the early part of the game, you could actually transition quite easily to double production of Vikings, use those to take out their anti-air, and then when you're pushing, since obviously you won't really have any solid anti-air with Cyclones as well as with Hellions, you will be able to, push with Hellbats, transform from the Hellion obviously, then with a bunch of Cyclone and transition towards Vikings, land the Vikings and push again. There's a lot of cool options that are available there. So I think the Viking change, I think that's really, really, really awesome. Last but not least, we see a couple of more changes here. I believe those are the last ones, yeah. We see changes to the battle cruiser. So notice, by the way, Marines, Marauders, and all those kinds of units did not get changed whatsoever. Good thing. But anyways, first and foremost, the battle cruiser. Changing the battle cruiser's abilities to be on a separate cooldown rather than relying on energy opens up the battle cruiser for more strategic plays. So as you may be aware, right now the battlecruiser relies on energy, and what that means is that you won't be able to use the teleportation as well as the Yamato cannon at the same time. However, they're going to be removing the energy bar, and they're going to put Yamato cannon and the tactical jump on a cooldown. So what you will be able to do is basically just immediately jump into your opponent's base, snipe their hive, and then get out, right? And the cooldown of it is rather long, but at the very least, since right now battlecruisers are mostly like a legacy unit, and sometimes you see them in Terran versus Terran, but once again, that's another one of those moves you make only when you're already ahead. Like, you don't really make battlecruisers, you know, as your core army all that often. It happens every now and then. Very specific scenarios, not really worth talking about, but you get the idea. It's a cool idea, and I actually would like to see more battlecruiser play. So once again, I'm a-okay with these changes. Last but not least, we see the Raven. We'd like to bring the Raven in a more favor we'd like to bring the Raven more into favor while not enabling the unit to cause stalemate games again. Since Terran has so many worker harassment options already, we wanted to increase the strength of the Ravens in battle. Due to the short duration, low health, and immobility of the auto turret, an increase to their damage should give Ravens a bit more firepower in combat, while not adding too much to their ability to harass worker lines. Now, I'm gonna name it right off right here, I suppose, you know. Honestly, you don't really harass with Ravens, and in many scenarios, you don't make Ravens at all. Ravens used to be a unit you would make if you had too much gas, and if you would randomly max out on them. That'd be great, because you could kill everything, because of the Hunter-Seeker missile and the PDD, and obviously you could do a lot of work with them. And right now, they see very little play once again. So they're buffing the auto turret somewhat from 16 to 24, and what that means apparently is that you know, they're gonna be able to take out Zerglings a little bit easier. Not sure. I don't think the Raven serves a very specific purpose right now in the Terran weaponry. I mean, the main thing it obviously serves is that it's a detector, and the PDD can help you survive for a little bit longer in combat. I've never been the biggest fan of the Raven unit, and while removing it would be a little silly as well, increasing the damage of the auto turret is not gonna make any differences in like realistic scenarios, you know. Basically, the only thing you change is just wait a little bit and let the Zerglings, you know, run away with the Zerglings, come back a second later, because the energy cost is still pretty high. And all in all, you're not gonna use a Raven as a defensive tool anyway, you know. So I'm not entirely sure on the Raven's part right here, but all in all, not gonna lie, the Terran changes look incredible. Alrighty, so next up we've got the Protos. Protos have seen significant changes and improvements in Legacy of the Void, and with this update we have a few things we want to improve even further. For one, we're aiming to make the race interactions with Terran mech more interesting. We'd also like to increase the power of the Zealot in certain areas compared to Adepts or Stalkers, and also make some generally cool unit improvements. So as you may be aware, as far as the Zealot goes, you don't really build them. That's where that story ends. Well, there are some scenarios where you do want to be building Zealots, in particular because the charge upgrade, they can be good tanks and they do quite a lot of damage when you warp them in. But in general, with the introduction of the Adept, and the Adept almost being the same cost, except that they've got a little bit more, you know, minerals and a little bit more gas as well. All in all, you don't really build all too many Zealots in many scenarios, and the Adept has really taken over and taken the Protoss armies by storm. So, you know, as my initial thoughts right here, Zealot buffs are much appreciated, and while that obviously will have to be dealt with by the other races as well, and it would have to be balanced, all in all, the thought process right here is very, very good. Also, the Tempest in Legacy of the Void is not that great. We made changes to the Immortal and other units to make mech a more viable route for Terrans facing off versus Protoss players. However, it quickly became apparent that late game Terran mech really struggled versus Tempest. Due to the Tempest's incredible siege range against ground and air units, and the unit's efficient supply to cost ratio, massing Tempest was an easy answer against Terran mech. In response, we'd like to increase the supply of the unit to better match the cost and effectiveness of the unit, as well as reduce the range of its anti-ground attack. These two nerfs are counterbalanced by a new ability which aims to create interesting interactions against siege tank lines. So what we're talking about right here is very specifically, the Protoss versus Terran matchup, where the Terran is going for mech, which already was very uncommon, but also was very easy to counter by the Protoss by just simply making a bunch of Tempest, as obviously mech is very slow, and other than, you know, getting a bunch of Viking, which aren't going to really counter any kind of ground army, at least before these changes, you wouldn't be able to very easily deal with it at all. Now, obviously, Tempest got incredible range, they're very expensive, but all in all, massing them obviously wasn't a very fun strategy. Okay, so due to the drastically increased effectiveness of the siege tank, we've added a new ability for the Tempest called Disruption Sphere. This ability launches a ball at the ground that acts as a zoning tool, forcing units, especially siege tanks, in that location to pack up and move elsewhere. We hope to see more diverse gameplay around this interaction based on the positioning and the composition of each side's army. So the changes are pretty straightforward. The increase of the supply count and in particular the anti-ground weapon range from 15 to 6 obviously are going to change it up significantly. However, they also got a new ability. Now first and foremost, let's have a look at the actual changes of the before and after of the anti-air range, or the anti-ground range. So look at this, right? That one Viking was able to hit the Tempest, but other than that, they're going to be able to clean up everything, and siege tank lines are just not going to really help against the Tempest whatsoever. However, in the newer version, as you may have already noticed, the range of that attack is going to change significantly, but the anti-air attack, so the air-to-air attack of the Tempest, is practically the same. However, in order to actually hit siege tanks now, the missile turrets are going to, you know, help out the Terran to defend against that sort of shenanigans. Now, here is the new ability. So it's going to be called Disruption Sphere, and what happens is that you put that like ball of like energy on the ground, and it deals very low amounts of damage over a very long duration. So as you can see right here, the Tempest are going to put those abilities on the ground, and the Terran, while they do take a little bit of damage here, they're just simply forced to move away, right? They're very much so forced to move away. Now, the one issue that I have with this ability, because I like the idea of it, is that it's a very specific ability, right? This will not come into play in Protos versus Protos. It will not come into play in Protos versus Zerg either. It's really just when the Terran player is going for mech and when they're going up against a Terran player in the first place, right? Now, it's hard to say how common mech will become, in particular with the changes to the siege tanks and all that sort of shenanigans. But all in all, I like the idea of the ability. It's a pretty cool concept. I'm not sure if there would have maybe been like an easier way to deal with that sort of stuff. But you know, all in all, I think it's not a bad thing. And obviously, because Vikings are still going to be rather good, they can you know, probably deal with all of the shenanigans still. But all in all, it's okay. It's okay. The thought process though is a cool idea. And whether or not this will make it to the final version in the game, I'm not entirely sure yet. It really much so depends on how powerful mech will truly become. Okay, next up, we got a change to the Zealot. In Legacy of the Void, Adepts and Stalkers have become the favored gateway units. We'd like to increase the Zealot movement speed with the charge upgrades researched. This would aim to significantly improve its performance versus kiting units, such as for example Terran Bio or the new Hydralisk on Creep, which we'll go over in a second. This change could allow the Zealot to sometimes be a core option, whereas in certain situations, such as when lurkers are involved, the relationship can change back to favoring Adepts or Stalkers. Also, for warp and harassment cases, this change could often make it's situationally appropriate to warp and Zealots over Adepts. So the research upgrade of charge on the Twilight Council will now also increase the Zealot's base movement speed by a whole bunch. What that means is that obviously they may be a little bit better and they may be a little bit more common. Now, obviously, if you would mess around with, say, the amount of tanking, or like the amount of tanking that they can do or the amount of damage that they dish out, both are already very significant. I definitely do like the idea because this may, this may very well make it a legit option to once again go for charge-based aggression as a Protoss as well. And while I'm not entirely sure if you would really, still warp in a lot more Adepts, once again, the thought process I agree with. Next up, we got the Carriers. For the Carrier, we believe the addition of the Release Interceptors ability had a negative effect on the game. In most cases, the ability becomes a test of simply clicking the ability before the Carrier dies. Therefore, we would like to go into a different direction by making Interceptors cheaper, thereby making the role of the Carrier clearer while also giving the unit a significant buff. So as you may be aware, the Interceptors are the little tiny thingies that the Carrier can make. They will do a whole lot of damage, and what you can use it, and what the idea behind it was when they first announced Legacy of the Void, was simply using it as a tool to harass a Terran player or a Zerg player for that matter, or Protoss, I guess. As it is right now, it's very, it's very accurate right here. You just sort of release all the Interceptors either at the beginning of the combat or right when the, the Carrier is about to die. And in many scenarios, it's just not a very fun mechanic. And in many scenarios, it requires significantly more micro on the player that's defending against the Carriers than, the player that is going for Carriers. So if the Interceptors are cheaper, If the interceptors are cheaper, players will need to focus more on targeting down the carriers than they do currently. This change, in combination with the changes we previously made to the carrier interceptor controls to behave more like they did in Brood War, should enable advanced carrier micro and allow for the units to perform in a way that reflects the skill of the controlling player. So the carrier changes are as follows: remove the release interceptor ability, and the interceptor's cost reduced from 25 minerals to 5 minerals, and the auto build is enabled from the start. So one of the main differences to the carrier, how it is in StarCraft 2 right now and how it used to be in Brood War, is the fact that you would be able to micro the interceptors a lot more efficiently. You could make them change targets on the fly, and you could also deploy them while moving. There are a couple of changes that they are making to make that a little bit more Brood War-esque. I'm not entirely sure if that's being, if that's really being, controlled right here. I mean, I'm not really reading about any control changes. But to make the unit a little bit closer to Brood War and allow players to, actually show skill when using a carrier is obviously much appreciated. Now, I'm still hoping here that the carrier is going to be a unit that doesn't just require you to press one button and then, maybe just attack, move, and then just sort of sit there and wait until the opposing player is going to be able to deal with them. In particular, when the opposing player needs to very specifically make the decision whether or not they want to target fire down the interceptors, or if they want to go for the carrier themselves, or if they, want to simply run and all that. It's very hard to judge and very hard to call what you want to do against carrier in that regard. And in many situations, I mean, I remember the Legacy of the Void beta very clearly. In many situations, you would have to, for example, in the Zerg versus Protos matchup, you would have to go for a very specific army composition that takes a long time to build up. So since you couldn't really attack into a player going for carrier, as they would just simply be able to kill you with them, you would have to switch into queens, get very heavy brute or very heavy ground support, add on the corrosive bio ability every now and then on the roaches, but you would also add in corruptor as well as parasitic bomb from the Viper. And all in all, you had to make a lot of adjustments in order to deal with the carrier, while the player that was going carrier just simply had to attack and click, right? Now, whether or not it's balanced is another question, but whether or not it's fun and whether or not it's actually fair in that regard is second to none, and I think that's far more important. So I like the idea of changing up the carrier and making it a more interesting unit in that regard. In particular, if it's allowed to be controlled more like it was in Brood War, I'm gonna be a-okay with that. Next up. This is for you Terran players and Zerg players alike out there. This is going to be a harsh one, but bear with me, okay? The Dark Templar. I'm not gonna show you the ability yet. We first want to mention that this is a highly experimental change, and we admittedly have a low degree of confidence of making it to the live game. We also want to point out that we clearly don't want to buff Dark Templars at this stage when they first enter in the game. So we're introducing an upgrade that will come into play after our Dark Templar shrine has been completed for some time. With that said, we'd like to add an ability with the goal of seeing if player skill using Dark Templar can be emphasized, even after the point when detection becomes more widely available. So here's what we're getting. We're getting an ability called Shadow Strike that you can research from the Dark Shrine. Very expensive. Research time is going to be 121 seconds, so very long. And the cooldown is going to be 21 seconds. Now here's what we're getting. Remember in the current stage, you just sort of have to scan and kill them? In this new version of the Dark Templar, they can blink. Let that sink in for a second, okay? Dark Templars can blink. Now here's the issue. I like the idea. I like the idea of making Dark Templar a more legit harassment option in a later stage in the game. I also like the idea of being able to, push with them not just in the early stages as harassment, and not really making the upgrade available too early, because at that point it may just be a little bit overpowered. But here's the issue. By the time you're actually going to be able to go for this, Shadow Strike ability, harassment to workers, in particular in Protos versus Terran, is almost irrelevant. I mean, once you get to a later stage of the game, right, where this, Shadow Strike ability might come into play, Terran is just going to be making more command centers and dropping mules anyway. And as far as Zerg goes, they can just simply remake all of the drones in just a heartbeat, right? And it's not really going to change it up very much whatsoever. It's also still going to be able to quite easily counter them with just a little bit of static defense. So I'm not entirely sure how big of a deal this will truly be, and I think in the pro scene, it won't really be any, effect whatsoever. I mean, in Legacy of the Void right now, they're just an harassment tool. You make them once upon a time, and you can move them around against later stages in the game and do some harass there. Potentially pick yourself up a planetary fortress if your opponent is bad, but the Dark Templar is just a unit that, in particular, rewards players that are not going up against very good players either, right? This Shadow Stride ability won't be really of any effect, I don't think, in the pro scene or, in Diamond level plus. Below that, though, it may be extremely frustrating to play against. But, I mean, I'm not gonna lie, I love playing with Zeratul in the campaign of StarCraft 2, and I really like the idea of being able to blink around with my DTs. But all in all, I wouldn't be surprised, just like they're saying right here, that it probably isn't going to make it to the live version of the game, just because of how it could potentially break, in particular lower level play, and not really have any use whatsoever in the pro scene. I mean, yeah, it's not really going to change the late game shenanigans whatsoever. What they could do is maybe give it an ability like dash around in the mineral line and do a whole bunch of damage in like a shorter amount of time. That could maybe make it a little bit more fun, because obviously in lower leagues people are going to lose their entire mineral line anyway. Whereas in the higher stages of StarCraft 2 and the higher leagues and whatnot, it still won't, it still will be a legit harassment tool. But other than that, it's hard to call how good this is going to be, and I don't think many people are making a huge fuss about this, but I don't think it's really going to be a very big factor in the game whatsoever. Next up, we got my favorite race in the game. I have always been a Zerg player at heart. I've been playing all the races as of late, but I always love playing Zerg the most. Next up, we're going to be talking about the changes that they are making to the Swarm, and I'm actually really excited for them. Okay, so let's have a look. So Zerg has had numerous new strategies since the launch of Legacy of the Void. Yet there are definitely areas of potential improvements available. We want to take this opportunity to experiment with heavy rebalance of the Swarm host, a redesign on the Infestor and its ability, and rebalancing of the strength of different Zerg tech paths. This means that there are changes to units and different tech options, as well as an adjustment to the Ravager that feels necessary, especially given the changes that we intend to make to the siege tank. Alrighty, so here goes nothing. The Swarm Host. The new role of the Swarm Host in Legacy of the Void seems to be good, but unit balance has made it impossible to confirm this. The next few months give us an opportunity to test whether this role is indeed good, or if we should go ahead and significantly reduce the cost of the unit so that players are incentivized to use them. Depending on the results of this test, we can determine how to best make future or further moves accordingly. So here's what we currently got, okay? The Swarm Host reduced cost from 150-100 to 175 and increases the Locust swoop range from 4 to 6. So that means they are able to land at opposing units a little bit faster. So here's the thing about the Swarm Host, right? And I'm not trying to be a Debbie Downer or negative about the Swarm Host in general, but in many scenarios, you're just simply going to be able to pick another unit and just have a better harassment tool available. The issue about the Swarm Host is that once you make them, you have dumped a lot of supply into a unit that can't be used in fights. So say you have a maximum amount of supply of 200, right? And 80 of that are going to be workers. That means that you have roughly, with queens and all that shenanigans left over, say we have 100 army supply. Now, if you make a whole bunch of Swarm Hosts, say you just make 5 of them, your army is going to efficiently be in the fighting cases, right? Where you're actually going to be going up against your Terran player or a Protos player in that matter. The army that you're going up against is going to be like 10, 15, 20% smaller because of the cost of the Swarm Host, as they aren't going to be able to be used in fights whatsoever. Basically, the Locusts can just get shut down very easily. So I don't think it's really a matter of discussing the cost of the Swarm Host, but really a reduction in the amount of supply that a Swarm Host costs. But then again, if you would reduce the cost of Swarm Hosts to say like 2 supply each or whatever, I don't even know what they currently are at, to be honest. I haven't played Swarm Hosts in a very long time, and maybe they are right and they will see a lot more play over the next couple of months. But if you would reduce them too much, right, and make the Swarm Host a too common unit, that would immediately mean as well that it would be extremely imbalanced again, as players would be able to make a ton of them and just simply absolutely bombard their opponents out of the game. So the Swarm Host is a cool unit. It has use. But what we want to prevent at all costs, and I was like a big advocate of this back in the heart of the Swarm. What we want to prevent at all costs is make it a unit once again that gives stalemate scenarios. As some of you may be aware, there have been the craziest of craziest matches in Heart of the Swarm in particular that went on for hours and hours and hours, just because the Swarm Host was a unit where you would just sort of burrow it, you would rally the Locust, push with static defense. Once you had enough static defense, you would uproot the static defense, move it forward, move over the swarm, the swarm host, and then push onwards once again. And you would do that for basically a couple of hours until you eventually broke your opponent's defenses. I think we want to avoid that at all costs, and I think pretty much everyone agrees with that. But whether or not the change to just the cost effectiveness of the swarm host, I'm not entirely sure. It could be a legit harassment tool in the middle stages of the game. But even then, it's still pretty difficult to pull off, as once you get to a later stage, you're gonna have to just sort of let them die, as, you know, both Terran and Protos aren't going to care for them very much anymore. So the Swarm Host, very unique unit, very cool concept. I'm not entirely sure how it will play out, in particular with all of the other changes that are being made. Anyhow, let's talk about the next unit, known as the Ravager. With the addition of Ravagers in Legacy of the Void, Roach Ravager compositions have become used quite frequently in multiple matchups. To achieve better diversity, we want to take a pass at 3 units: the Ravager, the Hydralisk, and the Baneling. For the Ravager, we want to add an armored flag to the unit. While this change is a response to the siege tank changes, it will also have a massive impact in Zerg vs Protoss. In order to compensate, we'd like to add an additional tech option by making a couple of changes to the Hydralisk. So, this may not sound very significant, adding a armor tech to the Ravager, but it's huge. It actually was something that was the case in the beta of Legacy of the Void as well, because what it means is that units such as the Immortal and units such as the Marauder deal bonus damage to armored. So by flagging the Ravager a armored unit, that means that Marauders as well as Immortals, in particular in Terran and Protoss is not going to be a big deal, they will be making a huge impact against Ravagers. It also means that it makes the Roach a less all-round unit. So in the past, if you would be going for, say, like a Roach-based army, and you would notice your opponent was going for a Protoss army based around Immortals, you would just simply move all of the Roaches you had into Ravagers, because you had the gas anyway, and use the leftover minerals to make a lot of Zerglings. And what would happen, while Ravagers technically have less hit points than a Roach does, Immortals would just simply be weaker against them, and a Zergling switch would line up perfectly, as long as your Queen injects were sufficient, right? So, Roach Ravager is an extremely powerful army composition that honestly, in my opinion, is a little bit boring and a little bit too powerful as well. It's not so much that it's overpowered in the current state of StarCraft, because changing it right now to armored would absolutely break a lot of the 2-base all-ins for Protoss, and I think that Immortal all-ins would once again become super powerful, and, you know, the aggression with, say, Marauders would become a lot more apparent. But I think, all in all, considering the changes that they want to make to the rest of the game, in particular to the Hydra, what we're going to look at, as well as the Baneling in just a second, I think this change is huge. I think it's really good for the overall outcome, and while it is a nerf to the Ravager, I don't think anyone is really going to complain about that, right? So as you may be aware, Stalkers are pretty good against armored units, as you will be able to see right here. I didn't even point those out, as it's really Immortals and Marauders that are the scariest. But apparently in 3 Stalker versus 3 Ravager situations right now, in the past, obviously the Ravagers would win, but Stalkers in the newer version of the game, I suppose, will end up being victorious in that stage. Now, obviously, there's no use of corrosive bile here, which, you know, makes the Stalkers lose a couple of shots, and you get the idea and the gist of it. But all in all, the Ravagers and the Roaches will be a less all-round composition. But in order to compensate for that, there are a couple of changes to the Hydralisk. Now, sadly, and I wish this was the case, sadly, it doesn't get turned into a tier 1 tech. You still have to get a lair before you can get it, so it's not going to be like, you know, there were some talks about how they should change up the position on the tech tree of the Hydralisk and the Roach, and therefore it would be more interesting and still make it Lurkers alert. You get the idea, but it's going to be still StarCraft 2. It's not going to be like in Brood War, but there are still changes in mind for the Hydralisk, and both are aimed at making the Hydralisk a core unit in the Zerg arsenal. First, we'd like to change how the speed upgrade works so that Hydralisk behave the same way as the other Zerg units on and off creep. The change would be accompanied by enabling the Evolve Muscular Augments to buff the overall movement speed of Hydralisk instead of just their speed off creep. A second area of change for the Hydralisk is a bit more of an experiment, but we wonder if the Hydralisk could be more of a core unit if their range is increased by 1. We'll watch these changes carefully, however, as the first change alone might already make Hydralisk a core option, especially if Zerg players creep well. So we'll need to test these changes thoroughly to ensure we make the best decision of this unit. So first and foremost, Hydralisk upgrade or attack range is going to apparently be experimentally changed from 5 to 6. That may not sound very big, but it's huge. It absolutely changes up the way the unit moves, as you will be able to kite so much more efficiently, in particular on creep with it. It will basically outrange all units that they're going up against as long as you micro well enough. In particular with the second upgrade right here as well, where you're going to be getting an additional 25% movement speed on creep, you will be able to kite for days. It changes the Hydralisk movement speed, will also be affected to other units while on creep. Muscular Augments now gives 25% speed boost, both on and off creep. So here's the thing about the Hydralisk. First and foremost in Terran versus Zerg. So in Terran versus Zerg, you don't really go Hydralisk, unless you want to go up against Lurker or whatever, but you don't really make Hydralisk all that often, as Bio Army is very good at cleaning it up, so Marine Marauder is extremely good against Hydralisk. And on top of that, obviously with the Siege Tank buff, it's going to be very difficult to push with a Hydralisk anyway, because they have a very low amount of HP. You need to accompany them with Roaches or Ravagers, right? And the issue here is that since Ravager are getting nerfed, I don't really think that you're going to be doing that all too much. And in many scenarios, I don't think it's really going to change Terran versus Zerg whatsoever. However, in Zerg versus Protos, I would argue that Hydralisk are already a little too powerful. I think that in Terran versus, or in Zerg versus Protos, you can get away with many instances where you just go pure Hydra and then reinforce with Zerglings once you're at Hive and get Ultras out. And there's very little the Protoss can do against that. In particular, I have been playing a lot of Hydra as of late. In particular, when your opponent is going for more of like defensive style, it's very clear that Hydralisk are absolutely king as like a core unit already. And I think that if they get 25% extra movement speed on creep and then an additional range as well, I think that may make the Hydralisk a little bit too powerful, in particular in Zerg versus Protoss, and a little bit too weak in Zerg versus Terran. So it's hard to say exactly how to make a unit a little bit more core heavy. They could add like 10 hit points to it and remove that, extra, attack range right there. I think that already would make it better, but you don't want to make the unit overpowered either, right? So it's hard to say exactly what this is going to be like. But anyway, here are the before and after. So obviously the movement speed is ludicrous. You're going to be able to move around against pretty much everything and kite them around for absolute days. Obviously, these are going to be adepts who deal bonus damage against light. While technically speaking, Protoss has a lot of counters available to Hydras, in many scenarios, in particular once you morph them into Lurker, you don't really have a good counter as Protoss against them, other than going for, say, disruptors. And you have a lot of counters in Protoss, but it seems like a lot of Protosses either don't counter them properly or aren't able to counter them properly. You know what I mean? Like, they've got a lot of units that deal bonus damage against light, such as Disruptor, or not so much Disruptor, I guess, but Disruptors are very good at the game, but such as Colossus, such as Adept, such as Disruptor, they're all very good at countering Hydra. But it still feels that the Hydras are a very good stepping stone to Lurker and then eventually Hive Tech, right? So, since it won't really change, Terran versus Zerg very much, at least I don't think so. I may be completely wrong, I'm mistaken here, right? I think it might very well make Protoss versus Zerg a little bit too heavily into the Hydralisk favor. Although, it's going to be interesting to see. We also see one change right here to the Baneling. So the Baneling is the third core unit we want to address. In order to incentivize players to opt for this tech option, we want to make Baneling stronger without seriously impacting how players shoot micro when splitting against them. Increasing the health of the unit felt like a solid option that hits both of these grounds. Zerg vs Zerg is a matchup where, generally speaking, the early game is going to be dominated by Zerglings and Banelings, right? And with this change, Banelings will become even more powerful. You may very well have to go for very early game armor upgrades if you want to be coming out ahead in Zerg vs Zerg, just because it's going to be much more difficult to pick off an individual Baneling with a group of Zerglings, as the Zerglings are still going to be able to pick off the Banelings eventually, but it's going to take them a whole lot longer. Additionally, if you're one of those players that switches into heavy roach play early on into the game, you better get started on practicing your Lings and Banes, as there's going to be a lot of 1 and 2 basal Lins once again. In particular, like the 13-12 aggression, which is super common in Zerg vs Zerg already, will become a lot more powerful. And while normally I don't think it's worth discussing the mirror matchups, this is a big deal in Zerg vs Zerg. Other than that, and I don't think it's a big deal for the good, by the way. I don't think that's a good thing for Zerg vs Zerg in general. But other than that, in Terran vs Zerg, it's huge. Obviously, you can see it right here already, but Marines are going to have a very hard time dealing with all of the aggression. And while it technically shouldn't, really affect splitting, in many scenarios it will, as you just simply have to have more time for your Marines to shoot down the Banes, and you just have to be smarter about your splits. But also in Terran, also in Protoss vs Zerg. So what happens right now is that already a lot of players have started playing a Baneling focused style. you can already defend a lot of Protos aggression by going for heavy Baneling play, in particular once you go for a Hydra switch afterwards. And guess what other units got buffed up, right? So while you currently see a lot of players transitioning from the Roach Ravager style already to a much more Zergling Baneling into Hydra heavy style, I suspect that that will be becoming even more powerful and even more popular. And I wonder if just a little buff to the Zealot is really going to counteract that change, you know? Because I wouldn't be surprised if after all of these changes, Baneling Hydra Ling is going to be absolute king in Protos versus Zerg, just because they seem to be able to counter pretty much everything that Protos has right now. So I'm a little worried in that regard. I'm a little worried for Zerg versus Zerg. Against Terran, I think it's an okay change, and it might, it will increase Mutaling Bane styles significantly, as obviously we saw the, you know, the buff or the nerf rather to the Liberators and therefore the buff to the Hydralisk. You know, Mutaling Bane will become a legit option once again, but you could also switch into, say, Roach Ravager Bane or like Hydra Bane or Zergling Bane, or you have a lot of options, and all in all, it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out. Now, one thing to note, by the way, as well, and I saw a little bit of confusion about that, obviously, once they are going to be introducing these changes, the siege tanks will be buffed significantly too, so I don't think it will really affect any kind of early game aggression against Terran as Zerg goes by, because siege tanks are going to be able to one-shot Banelings easily. Yeah, so real quick, I just checked it out right here. The damage of the siege tank will be increased to 40 damage plus 30 against armored. So that does mean that Banelings will get one shot even without any armor upgrades on them, right? And obviously it's only going to be the middle part. The splash damage will change up that effectiveness a little bit, but siege tanks are going to be a legit counter to early game Zerg aggression for sure. Last but not least, we're going to be talking about the Infestor. So the Infestor deserves some love, as we've seen this sentiment echoed by our players. With that in mind, we have some more experimental changes to test on this front, similar to the Dark Templar's Shadow Stride ability. These changes certainly push the boundaries, but we are curious to see if something more extreme would be cool for the Infestor. We'd like to explore adding a new ability known as Deep Tunnel. Now, for those of you that have played Heroes of the Storm, you know what Deep Tunnel means. That allows Infestors to tunnel anywhere which they have vision for an energy cost. Secondly, we'd like to allow Infestors to cast all spells while burrowed. To make the unit easier to find a target, we've added a small collision radius to the Infestor that exists even while it's burrowed, so that players can more easily target the unit with the attacks or spells, sort of like feedback. Has a collision radius while burrowed, but smaller than normal. Can cast all abilities while burrowed, so that includes obviously the fungal growth. And the Deep Tunnel ability allows you to tunnel underground for a 50 mana cost, can cast anywhere with vision, and provides an audible warning to the enemy when Deep Tunnel begins. I like it. I like it. Maybe I'm biased, but I haven't played Infestor in a very long time, other than, you know, to catch dropships, after which I can corrosive bile them down. The only reason why you really go for the Infestor is because you want to be dealing with the early game aggression, or, you know, in the late game you have a lot of gas left over, so you want to sort of fungal the Terran players, you know, bio army. I think this is going to be an interesting change that could potentially make it a more, you know, favorable harassment tool. Now, in the past, as you may be aware, and this is like a long time ago, they've made one critical change to the Infestor that made it all of a sudden a much weaker harassment tool, and that is the fact that the, you know, little Terran things, the Infested Terrans, I can't believe it, I actually had to quickly look up the name of the ability if it's actually called Infested Terran, but yeah, it is. The Infested Terrans would benefit from the upgrades that you would have to your carapace, as well as your missile upgrades in the Evolution Chamber. That would make them a legit harassment tool, as you could be burrowing underneath like a Terran's, for example, behind the Terran's mineral line, then pop out all of the Infested Terrans, deal a lot of damage, and then get out again, right? As it is right now, though, it's a very costly move to go for, as it's not particularly great. But because you will be able to, you know, now fungal while burrowed, I think it may be a little bit too powerful as well. It's hard to say how big of a deal this will truly be, and I think I would rather see that change reverted to where the Infested Terrans will once again deal damage based on the amount of upgrades that you have in the Evolution Chamber. I think that would make it a much more common strategy, and I would also love to see a buff to the other ability, the Neural Parasite. They have increased the range of it since in Legacy of the Void. They changed the range of the Neural Parasite significantly, but I have not seen it in forever. And I like the deep tunnel ability as well. I'm just not sure if you want to be, you know, seeing the fungal growth being cast while burrowed. That sounds honestly a little bit ridiculous. And if you're not scanning ahead or like you're not bringing observers to the fight, you're going to be in for a bad day. As all of a sudden a bunch of infestors can pop out and all of your army's dead. I mean, the fungal will be absolutely ludicrous in particular. So I would love to see some changes to the neuroparasite as well as the infested Terrans instead. I think that would be cool, but either way, we'll see. Last but not least, we have a change to the Brute Lord. So, with the changes to Terran, we want to ensure that the Terran Thor has the potential to help counter the Brute Lords. Therefore, we've reduced the Brute Lord's range to match the Thor's anti-air attack range from 11 to 10. Now, earlier I mentioned this as well, right? But in many scenarios, what happens is that the Brute Lord will be throwing around the Brutelings, which will start tickling and blocking the pathing for the Thor, at which point you can micro back with the Brute Lords and just keep on shooting forward, right? I don't think in many scenarios this will really affect that play very much, and while technically speaking, Thors are going to be able to counter Brute Lords reasonably well, I'm pretty sure that Brute Lords will still easily come out on top in many of those scenarios, just because you will be able to just kill the Thors relatively easily, as they're going to be blocked by pathing, at which point you can, you know, micro them forward, micro them backwards, in between throwing around the Brutelings, right? So while I do agree with the change to nerf it slightly, I would rather see a buff to the Thor instead, to maybe 12 anti-attack range or something, and leave the attack range of the Brute Lord to 11. And just to clarify, that's obviously going to be the anti-air range of the Thor. I think it would be a little bit more efficient. Either way though, this has been a very long video and a very long list of changes. They are making some significant moves to the StarCraft 2 multiplayer, and all in all, I think it is for the good. I think it's a really good change to make, and I think it will make the multiplayer more exciting. I'm also very happy to see that there is once again proof right here that there are some significant changes that they are willing to make the game more interesting, right? Obviously, everyone was always going to be a little bit worried, in particular once, you know, all of the expansion had been released, and everyone's a little worried that, you know, that's going to be the end for development, right? That's where we're going to be calling it quits. Well, no. It turns out that even like a year after the release of Legacy of the Void, we will still be seeing significant changes and more developments for StarCraft 2. All in all, I can't say whether or not this is good or bad, but I think the general consensus is that, you know, buffing underused units and nerfing often used units is a great idea, and it will make the game more interesting, at least over time. I'm also happy to see that we didn't see any kind of crazy, you know, additional units that get added or whatever, but just a couple of changes to abilities instead to make existing units more interesting. I think that's great as well. And last but not least, I am very happy to see that the primary thing that, you know, has been changing, I suppose, is that units got buffed instead of nerfed. I don't know how many of you remember Wings of Liberty patch notes, but basically what would change is that all of the units just simply got a nerf instead of getting a buff. And I don't know how many of you play Brute War either, but in Brute War, basically all units were overpowered, and because all of them were overpowered, it made the game significantly more interesting. So if you made it all the way to the end of this video, definitely let me know what your thoughts on these changes are down below in the comment section of the video. Even if you just, you know, write down the word good or the word bad, I will be able to judge your opinions just by the amount of comments that I'm seeing, right? Do you like it? Do you dislike it? You know, do you prefer the current version of the game? Do you think this is too drastic? Do you think this is a great option? Do you think this is a bad idea? Let me know down below. But just typing the word good or bad will already give me a very good indication of what you think of it. And, you know, personally, I'm excited for it. But other than that, I want to thank you all for watching. Have an amazing day. Do not forget to smile. And I will see you all in the next one.